We're going to start with the first of our four topics, the oversight of the financial reporting process. Certainly the increasing complexity of business, the globalization of business, and the emergence of new risks are really demanding a lot from the attention from audit committees. And you may recall that, at least in the U.S., the Sarbanes-Oxley Act really legally established the audit committee the responsibility of overseeing the financial reporting process of the issuer. So my first question is to our singular audit committee member here. Michelle, the audit committee is charged with overseeing that financial reporting process of the issuer. How has the audit committee's relationship changed with respect to management and internal audit? And what challenges do you think the audit committee will face as it relates to financial reporting and quality control going forward?
You know, it's interesting because I've been on audit committees for over 20 years. I've chaired audit committees of all types of companies, all sizes of companies over that period of time as well, both domestically as well as internationally. And so I've seen, quite frankly, a lot of change that has occurred, and a lot of change that has happened since Sarbanes-Oxley. So over the last 10 years, there's been dramatic change, and in some cases, there's been not a lot of change. And I'll clarify that. The thing I find heartening about where we are today is that there is much more ownership by the audit committees of our roles and responsibilities. There is, I think, backbone now on the part of audit committees, a willingness to dive deeply into topics that perhaps 10 years ago there wasn't as much attention paid, if you will. We are much more involved and engaged in the development of our agendas, on the development of the topics on which we would want to make sure that we have information on, in terms of also having educational time within the audit committees, so that as we begin to think about, either critical accounting judgments or I'll give you a good case in point. One of my boards just recently did a significant acquisition. Our deep dive topic, as we call them deep dive topics, this year was on, or in July, was on purchase accounting. And so as we went through our deep dive topic, we married that purchase accounting discussion to the actual transaction that we were just in the process of executing, and talked about purchase accounting and the accounting issues and what our disclosures would have to be using an actual transaction. And so it was real live, so that when we did our 10Q discussion, it was a pretty easy discussion because we had just gone through it as part of our deep dive discussion. That type of engagement and direction and involvement would not have happened 10 years ago. It would have been interesting if we would have even had a discussion on the actual nits and gnats of purchase accounting, and to have it be something that's more than cursory we wouldn't have done that 10 years ago. So we're getting, I think, I use that as an example to say we are getting much more engaged, much more involved. Management realizes that they need to get the audit committee involved in the details and have the audit committee have ownership in the details. Earlier, I think there was not a belief that we needed to do that, Trust us, everything's going fine. We'll give you sort of the general outline, and that's enough for the audit committees. I think management is past that. The audit committees are past that. We're deeper into that information. Marry that to our relationship with internal audit, and you didn't mention internal audit when you were giving your introductory remarks, but I think internal audit has become just an incredibly valuable part of this process for not only audit committees, but for the process of audit quality. I use our internal audit group as our arms and legs, as our independent voice within the organization. As audit committee chair, I protect them from the slings and arrows that they may have, because it's very difficult for them to walk that fine line of being independent and objective, but still realizing that their careers typically will be within the company. And so the audit committee has to really walk a fine line with them to protect them. And we're finding that the relationship between the two has become, between the audit committee chair in particular and the audit committee and internal audit, has become much more substantive over these last 10 years. Internal audit now has a very specific role. Their information gathering and their role within the organization to be the eyes and ears of the audit committee, I think is becoming more and more understood within the organizations. And that relationship has strengthened, I think, deeply over this period of time. I think the challenge we have is, quite frankly, time management. I mean, to me, I've had audit committee meetings that I would say on average for most of my companies are in-person meetings are, let's say, 5 times a year, 3 hours at a crack, sometimes 4. We have telephone conference meetings, and those telephone meetings started out being reviews of the quarterly, the 10 Qs. That was maybe a half hour. Those meetings are now an hour by phone, and that's 4 or 5 times a year. I have as an audit committee chair meetings with the external auditors, with the internal auditors, phone calls with the CFO routinely, at least probably every 6 weeks, if not every month, to make sure that I understand what's going on. So time management is a challenge for audit committees today. And as we get more involved in compliance and risk orientation, it is extending that responsibility and that reach. So I think that, to me, is one of the biggest challenges, is how do we do everything that is now on our plates, bringing in the compliance components as well as the financial reporting components. And I see a great deal of overlap between the two, because a lot of the areas of risk ultimately will show up in your financial statements somewhere or other. So I don't disagree with some of the responsibilities that we have, but it's getting to be a bit much in terms of just the amount of time that we engage in this. So I'll stop with that.
So Bob, let's take that. I mean, what Michelle talked about was really the evolution of this part of the profession. Where are we in that evolution?
Well, in my view, I think overall we're in a relatively good place and an immeasurably better place than we were 10 years ago. Now, you had a little math issue. See, the PCOB was not declared operational until January of 2013, so I'm going to go with the 10 years. But the changes implemented, I just want to remind us all that journey was not even. We spent a year or so trying to figure all this out. What's the audit committee what are they supposed to change now that they have these new responsibilities? And we spent a couple years trying to implement 404, and the aftermath of the 2004 assessment was several years of repairs and maintenance, right, getting rid of material weaknesses, significant deficiencies, regular deficiencies. And right about then, as we're in the middle of that, then AS5 came out, and we had to figure out how do we rescale 404 to sort of get it right or live within the spirit of the new standard, but still have a robust audit process to give an effectiveness report. And we also had a number of new accounting standards at that time. So
and a financial crisis.
And the financial crisis, which just created all kinds of issues for the audit committee. So if you think about it, I think we've had 3, maybe 4 years, but certainly the last few years have been more or less steady state, where I think some of the stuff has been solidified. So we really had some unusual work to do as a result of Sarbanes, particularly 404. Now that has been sort of institutionalized now, where it's part of the audit. The time issue that Michelle mentioned, couldn't be worse. I mean, we remember how much time an audit committee we'd have to spend on some of these compliance issues. Right. First time to go through it, it was a big deal. So I think financial reporting oversight is in relatively good shape certainly where I see it at the sort of the mega companies. Where I wonder, though, as you think about you use whatever number you want, 12, 15,000 public companies, most of them are in that middle market. I'm just not sure of the consistency across the market. I have the privilege of working with committees like the kind of companies that Michelle serves as audit committee chair. And I don't see, in the smaller markets and the smaller companies, I'm not sure they've traveled as far, but that's just speculation on my part. And I do think it can improve. I think it needs to continue to evolve, and I think later in this discussion we'll talk about it, but I think really there's more to be done in terms of oversight of the external audit.
Okay. So, Brian, as you hear all of this, and Bob talked a little bit about 404, and certainly that internal control of financial reporting has garnered a lot of attention. But Michelle also touched on the expansion of the responsibilities of the audit committee. Are there other things that the audit committee should or shouldn't have on their agendas? What sort of other expansion do you see? For instance, audit committees dealing with enterprise risk management, other conflict mineral reporting that's just recently come out, other emerging risks like cybersecurity and fraud and other corruption issues. How do you see the audit committee dealing with those things?
Well, I think I have to echo Michelle's comments. Audit committee agendas are long, and they're getting longer. I think pre-read materials, that information that's sent out in advance sometimes could be in the hundreds of pages. And that's in addition to whatever goes out for the board meeting. And so there's a great deal of pressure. And I think just from my perspective, getting the right amount of time on the agenda is very important. Michelle's comments about prioritization and time management is critical. I think audit committees have to spend a lot of time with the agenda as to, well, what goes on the agenda, how much time do we give to each of these topics, and how do we stay on track? I think are really big challenges. I've seen a big push for development and expansion of, call it corporate risk management groups, whether that's global or even domestic, but you've got a lot of groups implementing in jurisdictions around the world their own versions of the FCPA, like the UK bribery, and there's expansion in lots of different aspects of what audit committees have to do. So I think it's probably reaching a tilt because I think the meetings do get longer. I think my observations are similar to yours, that a medium to large public company audit committee meets 8 to 12 times a year. There'll be 1 to 2 meetings per quarter, really just to talk about the press release and or the 34 Act filing. Those are generally telephonic, 30 minutes to an hour is pretty typical from what I see. There's at least 4 4-hour meetings where you have to get through all the rest of the agenda. And to add any more to that is just really becomes problematic because the pre-read gets longer, it just becomes a bigger challenge. Everyone has to make the very best value of what you can during the meeting, which means there's a whole lot of things that have to occur offline or informally before the meeting. Again, the pre-read is part of that. The meetings, my experience as a partner is you can't resolve anything at an audit committee meeting. It has to be resolved in advance. The meeting is the more formalization of it when everyone finally acknowledges an agreement, but you can't take time of that critical agenda to work through issues. They have to be solved in advance. And I had one final observation. It's been a fairly quiet couple of years on the accounting front from a practitioner standpoint. I realize the FASB and the FASB, the IASB, and now the new PCC is a lot of stuff on the agenda, and I see a watershed of new accounting coming the way of clients, and that's just going to add to this agenda of what we're already struggling with to get through on a daily basis.
All right, so we're not going to have time to dive into this question deeply here, but just kind of show of hands. Do you feel like that what the audit committee has been saddled with is everything that we've talked about is important for the organization to deal with? It's important for the board, the entire board, to have their arms around. Do you feel like the audit committee is saddled with too much responsibility and that we ought to refocus that responsibility? Or do you think that that all these things are the things that we've talked about are rightly placed with the audit committee?
I think they're rightly placed, and I think there's a lot of debate at committees about at what level does it become too strategic for the audit committee and should go to the full board? But the topics that we're talking about are squarely in the audit committee's purview, in my view.
Okay.
I agree.
You know, to me, they have to be where they are. The issues aren't going to go away. So take
Nope.
risk as an example. There's no question that ultimately risk oversight is the responsibility of the full board. But you can't take it away from the audit committee and put it at the full board and effectively complete the oversight.
Right.
You can create another risk committee, but then you're saddled with trying to make sure that the risk committee has got the risks allocated to the other committees.
Right.
So, you know, even though I think it's a big plate overflowing, I don't think there are any great alternatives to another approach.
And I think Brian's right, though. We do get a lot of our work done outside of that room. I mean, there's no way you can get everything that we have to do done during the meeting time. And so there is just a lot of work that you got to get done. But when I think about risk and the role of risk at the audit committee level, I like to say we're responsible for making sure that there is a process, and that by that process, the risks ultimately are allocated to either the full board or to the respective committees. And then our responsibility is to make sure that those committees or the full board indeed calendar those risks so that they have the appropriate oversight and visibility to those things that they are responsible for. So it does add a lot of responsibility on the plate of the audit committee, but I don't see anywhere else that it can go and get the attention and oversight that it needs.
This is important because what we're talking about here, then, if that is the conclusion, when we get to the group discussion, I'll be interested in others' feedback, but what we're talking about here then is not changing what the audit committee is focused on necessarily, but we are talking about making sure that the audit committee is better equipped to handle its responsibilities. I say all the time that being on an audit committee is a part-time job with full-time responsibility, and that means the audit committee needs resources. So Mark, just touch base with us on the types of research that has been done out there on the topic of audit committee effectiveness.
Right, and the topic here is the financial reporting process, as we brought up. Well, first of all, the thing that jumps off the page is before Sarbanes-Oxley, there was almost no research on audit committees. And since then, it's mushroomed into a very big and large area, and I think a very, very interesting area. Another thing to note here is that it really represents a fundamental shift in the kinds of research that audit committee academics are doing. So, and this mirrors really a fundamental shift in the approach regulators have taken to try to boost audit quality. And so what I'm talking about here is the audit committee characteristics of Sarbanes-Oxley really targeted client demand and trying to hit sort of the demand side and change client behavior. Now that kind of contrasts with most of the other Sarbanes-Oxley provisions and previous regulatory intervention in the audit markets that tended to target the supply side, and we're trying to sort of change auditor behavior to supply higher audit quality. So for example, the near ban on non-audit services is really an attempt to increase auditors' incentives to supply more audit quality by reducing their reliance or on financial dependency on the client. Now, what kinds of research questions are asked here? The vast majority of the research here looks at the relationship between audit committee characteristics and audit quality. And the audit committee characteristics tie in very well with what some of Michelle's comments were. So the biggest characteristics are the ones driven by regulation and best practices like audit committee independence, financial expertise, audit committee size, meeting frequency in a lot of this research, and compensation of the audit committee and various other things.
And we're not paid enough, by the way.
Well, you know what, Michelle? I have some very good news for you in some of this research about audit committee. So hold on. But these characteristics, if you look at these audit committee characteristics, they're really designed, the attention here is to change the incentives of the demand for audit quality by clients. So for example, audit committee independence should pump up the incentives to demand more audit quality. But also the competencies and the abilities of the client to achieve the demanded level of audit quality. For example, financial expertise on the audit committees. Now, in response to this specific question about financial reporting process. Very little research done here. This is the least researched area in the audit committee research. One group of this research you can look at does look at the relationship between audit committees and the internal audit function, as Michelle, you mentioned. And these generally find, very few studies, generally find that a better relationship leads to a better internal audit function. You know, bigger audit committees tend to have bigger internal audit departments. There's also some evidence that if the audit committee is a little more involved in the oversight of the internal audit function relative to management, those companies tend to have better internal controls over financial reporting. Another group of these studies looks at the association between audit committee characteristics and reported internal control weaknesses. So this is tangential evidence. This is a little bit indirect. But these studies tend to find that companies with more independent and more financial expertise on the audit committee tend to report fewer internal control weaknesses, and those weaknesses tend to get resolved more quickly. There's also evidence that audit committees, that companies that report internal control weaknesses tend to fire their audit committee more frequently, tend to turn over the audit committee more frequently. So that provides incentives for audit committees, of course, to look at these issues. There's also some evidence that audit committees are associated with, larger audit committees are associated with more accurate financial or management for earnings forecasts, consistent with a better quality internal reporting environment. So in summary then, the research here I think is quite limited. There's a lot more to be learned in this area. One path forward is to dig deeper into these relationships between the audit committee and the internal audit function, the audit committee and management. Another path is to identify new audit committee characteristics that may be associated with auditing quality. For example, personal characteristics or social ties of the board. And in fact, there's some research at the conference this week on this, and I believe the CAQ has funded some research in this area within the last couple of years. But a major barrier in this research and all the research in the audit committee area is simply lack of data. There's not much information. The proxy statement information is interesting and provides some interesting information, but without more data about what actually goes on inside that black box and what the audit committee really does, I think it's going to be hard to move this, particularly this area of the audit committee research forward.
Just a question, Mark, on the data access, is this, I mean, to have direct access to companies and audit committees to not have to rely on just public reports, but some kind of survey tool or interview tool, is it, if people have tried, are they just being told by whether it's the corporate secretary or the board members themselves that they're just too concerned they're going to get into private information and the like? I mean, is there a barrier there?
Well, I think generally speaking, there's a reluctance on the part of client firms to disclose information they don't have to disclose, especially when it could reveal proprietary information or information that they feel may be interpreted incorrectly. Just, a healthy dispute about an auditing application, for example, may be misinterpreted. Sure. So I think there's just a general reluctance on the whole.
Okay. All right, as I expected, no shortage of comments on all these topics. We have about 35 minutes to cover our next three topics, so we're going to pick up before we get into the open dialogue portion. So let's move on to the composition of the audit committee, its experience, its training, its resources. And Bob, I'm going to start with you. We talked about SOX, and SOX really has led to a transformation in some respects of the composition of the audit committee. What have you been most and least impressed with in terms of the changes in the composition of audit committees over the years?
Well, I mean, as you know, I'm not easily impressed. So, no, I think the most impressive piece is the sea change in the level of commitment, understanding, and willingness to take on issues by the audit committee over that time. I mean, to have a deep dive into purchase accounting in the more than 10 years ago would have been a very unusual thing. And I see audit committees that have dedicate almost a whole meeting to risk and really want to dig down and make sure that they understand the nature of the risk, how it fits into the business plan, the strategy of the company. I mean, things have really moved, a couple of standard deviations in the right direction. I think, though, and I'll be a little provocative, but I think in the area of the external audit, there's some challenges. So this would, I guess, go into the least impressed category. There's a few sort of examples I could use. I remember in early days, and I mean, you know, in 2003, 2004, as we were just sort of retooling the relationship, we used to get questions like, do you have adequate budgets and resources to perform a quality audit? We're overseeing this. You're the provider. We have to trust you that you know how to do this. You know, do you have enough to work with to deliver a quality audit? Those questions, I haven't heard that question in five or 6 years. It's a good question, though. Or the question, if we were to allocate some more resources to the external audit, let's say it's another X hours or another X $1,000, what would you put that to? You're the partner, you know, what are the things that you, if you had available some more resources, what auditing area, what would you change, or what would you do with that sort of incremental spend? And I also think, we don't really hear that recently, but I always thought those were very thought-provoking questions and very thoughtful. I also don't see a lot of, I'll just call it keen interest, because there's definitely interest. We, every year, present our audit scope. And generally it's a PowerPoint thing. Here's our coverage, here are the locations we're visiting, here's our team, here's how we're gonna, here's our risk areas, here's our audit response, those kinds of things. We rarely get any sort of dialogue around that. I mean, politely listen to it and so forth. I'm always, when we prepare, we're always ready for challenges or questions. And it's really kind of been routinized in my view. And I think interest in PCOB inspections has been a challenge. I think interest is moderate at best. It's certainly at its height when that company is this year being inspected. And we always tell clients ahead of time, hey, ABC company's been selected. They're going to be here in 6 weeks. They're going to be on the ground for so long. Those are actually good years because the audit committee is very interested in how it's going. Please report to us any problems. Did you get any comments? Do they tell you whether they're part 1 or part 2? I mean, all the kinds of things you would expect. But it's tough for us to get good agenda time to report our overall firm results. Yet, to me, those are fundamental to the qualifications. And when you do report your firm results, and whether it's part 1 or a list of the issues surfaced, the thoughtful audit committee will say, well, how does that affect our audit? So you've got an issue with documentation. You've got an issue with skepticism. What are the areas that you're retooling or changing, because that observation, if it goes to your whole firm, you must be sensitive to it on the job here. So I don't know. I think things like AS16, I think the board's release on audit committees about PCOB inspections last August has helped a lot. And it helps the audit committee know, without us having to tell them, well, these are the kinds of things we should be asking. So I'm kind of hopeful as we get into 2013 and beyond, we'll have more success trying to educate the audit committee on the whole inspection and being regulated as a profession.
So when you see questions coming through, and Brian, I asked this question of you too, are these, when the good questions come through, are they coming through the financial expert more than anybody else? Do you see the financial expert really making a difference in the audit committee, or is it just the audit committee's heightened awareness of the issues?
Let me start. I think the financial expert is largely tooled to financial reporting and not really tooled to auditing. I still believe that while that was never the focus or the sort of laser focus of Sarbanes, as things have evolved, the firms are spending more time in training and everything else on the auditing side, less on accounting because there haven't been many new standards, and we're investing most there. So even the financial expert, depending on what their background is, may or may not have a good sense of the audit other than through the experience gained through cumulative service on audit committees. So
Brian, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it comes from the audit committee in general, not from any particular skill set.
Okay.
But I would challenge the point that you made around what types of questions might an audit committee ask, because, for example, the questions around fees. I link fees to audit scope in the audit plan. And I would expect that when we have gone through the audit plan and you have given me the various characteristics and how you're going to do risk and what your approach to the audit would be, et cetera, and then you say these are the amount of hours it's going to take and this is the fee we're going to give, I'm not going to ask you what would you do with more money. I'm going to say, are you going to be able to deliver a quality audit that we've agreed to at this level and with these hours? And hopefully your answer is yes, and that's, we'll move on from there. But I would expect, to me, a fee is an output. I would expect the bulk of the discussion and the bulk of the challenge to be around the audit scope and the audit plan. That's where I would be.
I think that'd be great. I mean, I just wish we had more back and forth on that, particularly the multinationals where you change somewhat where you go on the ground. You always perform audit procedures on the whole company, but whether it's China or South America, in other words, when you have rotating countries, I call them, or omnipresent teams on the ground, I think that's a great place for the audit committee to. Well, let me understand. Didn't you go there last year? I mean, we're just trying to understand how we think it through. I don't think fees is really should be the focus of the discussion. I think making certain that what gets delivered at the end protects the company, the audit committee, and what I call the durability of the financial statements at the end of the day is the most important element. I'm just saying we don't get a lot of questions on that.
But just to weigh in on this, Michelle, there is some evidence that companies, the clients who pay higher audit fees to their auditors have fewer restatements, less earnings management, and of course more audit hours. Now there's selection issues with all these sorts of things. But the other thing is, back to your point, and audit committees who are paid more tend to pay more fees to their auditor. So this is that connection.
Yeah, that may be the connection, but I may be naive, but I believe that I'm asking, as an audit committee chair, I am asking my auditors to give me a quality audit, period, full stop. I'm not asking them to cut corners. I'm not asking them to, give me a lowball fee, and so therefore the amount of hours they're going to, shave off, an audit team here, and they're going to do this by phone as opposed to in person. And I'm not asking that. I'm asking for a quality audit. Here's the plan. Here's the scope. Tell me what it's going to take to deliver that. I defy you to find an audit committee that says, we're asking for an audit on the cheap. I defy you to say that. And so, therefore, this linkage between what fees are being given and the quality of audit that's being produced, I'm trying to figure out where is that nexus and who is driving that? Because, again, I defy you to find an audit committee that actually says, give me a cheapo audit.
Right.
So why do we get that? Why do we get that disconnect?
I think you're right, Michelle. I think you won't find an audit committee that says, I want the lowest priced audit I can get.
Yeah.
But what you will find is an audit committee that says, tell me what it's going to take to get the job done, what you think is right. And then there's a comparison of the dollars. And there's quite naturally a follow-on question that says, well, this firm says they can do a quality audit for these dollars. You say it's going to take these dollars. We've got to reconcile the two.
And you know what I say? I say audit firms need to get a backbone. And if it takes you more dollars with a certain amount of resource to do that work and to do that work well, then you need to get a backbone and push back on the audit committees and say, this is what it's going to take to give you a good audit. And if you cave, that's your problem.
I can't argue with that because particularly if you're the incumbent and I can't use examples. If you know that there are some complexities that any other firm would spend a few days talking to management and look at the financials, wouldn't have any clue about. What will happen with that other audit, if you choose that, is there's going to be overruns and extra time, which they may or may not bill for.
Right.
So the incumbent auditor should have a very keen sense, having just completed an examination, of why it's, 8% higher than people might expect.
Yeah, and you need to push back.
Yeah.
So briefly, Michelle, in just a minute or two we have left on this topic, talk about the difference between, Bob touched earlier on the mega corporations versus the average mid-sized company. Talk about the difference in the composition that you see because you have experience in both.
I think and I hate to make generalizations, and I'm going to make one, but I don't really mean to make one. But I think there is a challenge with small and mid-sized firms with getting, I'll call them A-level players onto their boards and onto their audits. I think there are some, and especially there are people that are looking at small companies that they see as potential growth, or small companies that have a name. I think there are some things that can attract, so what I call A players to those smaller firms. But in general, I like to say that there is a board out there for everyone, and so you get differing levels of experience, you get differing levels of perhaps education and training around certain topics and expertise that go into a person's background. And I do worry that at perhaps some smaller companies, one, they typically don't have large audit committees, and so they have smaller numbers because they may have smaller numbers on their boards. And so you don't have that robustness, because I'll take one of my audit committees. We have 5 members on our audit committee, and I know that's on the high end. Some audit committees only have 3, and if one person is absent, then you have 2. And so it's hard to get a lot of robust conversations when you don't have that level. If you don't have the level of background and expertise coming in the door, and if you don't have the number of people that can bring their divergent experience and expertise to the conversation.
Right. So, Mark, with all that as backdrop, talk to us about research that touches on the composition of the audit committee versus...
Okay, I mentioned the characteristics that are looked at, and you can sort of look at this research into two areas, two groups. So inputs to the audit process, and the idea is whether or not audit committee characteristics drive the inputs, the kind of auditors, the amount of fees you pay the auditor, that sort of thing, whether or not that is associated with high quality inputs, and whether or not high quality or effective audit committees are associated with high quality outputs. And I think kind of what we're talking about here is the output part. That's the vast majority of this research. And there's just lots of evidence that at least audit committee independence and expertise are associated with lots of high quality outputs, like fewer restatements, accruals that are less likely to be managed towards benchmarks, more conservative accounting, auditors who are more willing to give going concern opinions, fewer auditor resignations, and the stock market reacts positively to companies who appoint experts to their audit committees, at least before Sarbanes-Oxley. And there's a small controversy about what kind of expertise, but generally speaking, this research finds that financial expertise related to accounting, hardcore, people with CPA experience tend to be the group here that seems to drive this. This is consistent with companies replacing audit committee members, more likely to replace audit committee members if they have restatements. So the audit committee's got a big incentive to do this. There's also, you mentioned large audit committees, frequent meetings, and even legal experts on the audit committee, generally speaking, are also associated with higher financial reporting quality. Interestingly, how the audit committee members are paid also seems to make a difference. So audit committee members with relatively more short-term stock options, those companies tend to have more restatements. Who chooses the audit committee members also seems to matter. So audit committee members who are chosen by nominating committees that are less independent tend to have CEOs on the audit committee. Those companies tend to have more restatements. And finally, in addition to increasing the client's incentives and competencies to fulfill a higher audit quality, audit committees also have a responsibility, and I think you mentioned this a little bit, to shield the auditor from management's influence. And there's some evidence that consistent with that, in that more independent audit committees tend to have fewer auditor dismissals after receiving going concern opinions. So to summarize, there's lots of evidence that these characteristics matter, particularly independence and expertise, to a lesser extent some of these other things. Going forward, a major problem from the research side with this literature is most of this research tends to be, not all of it of course, but tends to be associations, not necessarily causality. That's something that permeates all social science research, and there's no, at the end of the day, there's no real solution to that problem, but it's something that researchers should be mindful too.
the audit committee's management of the external auditor relationship. And I know we can spend more than 10 minutes on this, but we're going to have to be pretty regimented. So Michelle, I'm going to turn back to you again as someone with a lot of experience in this. What do you consider as an audit committee member? What should the audit committee consider when they're selecting an external auditor?
Okay, so I'm thinking when you say selecting an auditor, you're talking about in a situation either where you're bringing in a new auditor. And quite frankly, I've just gone through that, and it's an interesting process because it's basically almost like what you need to think about whenever you have an existing auditor and you're thinking about going forward with them and what you should be considering. We look at resources. What do they, both nationally as well as locally, do they service companies of similar size, of similar complexity? Let's say if you're in a manufacturing industry, do they have a large manufacturing client base? If you're in financial services, a large financial services base. Because you want to make sure that they have the expertise and the experience to service you and service you well. That's at the national level. You also need to make sure that they have that at the local level. You need to be sure that the local office has the resources in it that if you need to pull in for your particular audit more resources they need to draw upon than perhaps your basic team, that there's people locally that they can get, tap into and bring over to help them do whatever they need to do. So looking at that resource level is important. Looking at the resources, if you're a global company, that they have both in the regions that your company's either in or going to, and making sure you understand how quality is attained, what the expertise and track record is of the people that would be leading that audit in those regional locations, understanding how that communication works between the lead partner and those individuals that are partners in those regions, and how that communication and their responsibilities work, because you have one audit and I hold the lead partner responsible. And so I need to understand how they're dealing with those other parts of their affiliations. I'm interested in how the lead partner is selected. I always do interviews of individuals that will be lead partners on my audit, and I want to see at least 2 partners, if not 3. And I want to understand what their background and experience is, how they like to communicate, where they see the complexity, how they deal with issues, how they deal with management, et cetera. So I want to have a selection. I don't want the firm to just give me somebody. I want to look at independence with, the small number now we have of large companies that can do complex audits. We use a lot of them to do internal audit projects for us, consulting products for us, tax work, blah, blah, blah. So doing an independence check is real important when you think about what firm you're going to be using. I want to understand how they would deal with our critical accounting judgments, and what they have they reviewed the critical accounting judgments, what is their take on it? Do they agree or disagree with some of the direction that we are taking? And do they have any new approaches or new thinking that we should be thinking about and considering? I want to understand how you transition for the work from one firm to another firm, and have they thought about how they would need to integrate and bring themselves into the organization? So there is a lot of work in terms of both the expertise and experience of the firm, but also their understanding and knowledge of my company and how they would indeed work with the critical issues that we have, how they would understand where the risk areas are, and whether or not they understand the culture of our company and the management team expertise that we have, and how they would work with that. The other aspect I would say is, and I spend a lot of time and focus on this, is how they deal with internal audit within a firm. I believe that there needs to be a much more robust relationship between external auditors and internal auditors. I think there needs to be more reliance on internal audit. I think they need to understand, we need to understand how they make that intersection and what they would like to do. So in general, quickly, that's what I would be looking at.
Okay, so Bob, I want to ask you, what are audit committees, once the auditor's selected, what do you see audit committees doing today to evaluate the external auditors? And I'm going to turn to Brian and ask him to take that one step further. What are they doing with respect to some of the information that's available out there, PCAOB inspection results, what happens when there's an indicator of negative quality, and what actions do you see audit committees taking if there is something hanging out there today? So,
Yeah, let me take that first part. I mean, generally the kinds of things we see, and let's go back to Michelle's point about what we promise. We're going to deliver a quality audit in a certain time frame at a certain cost. So, you know, delivering on whatever the promise is top of mind. The continuity, leadership, and competence of the engagement team. It's a confidence thing. You know, you see a partner and a team around that partner that gives you confidence. And there's a number of service-related issues, responsiveness, issues recognition, and resolution. I'm sorry. No surprises, no last-minute difficulties to throw the 10Q and say, oh, we can't file. We just came up with something. Timeliness and so forth. One of the things that's happened in the last year, I think it was last October, is that 7-organization publication on the annual auditor assessment. It's got a lot of these things sort of swept into it, and I don't know if it's being used, but because we only have had that 1 year end so far. But that's a great tool, and I'm hoping that it gets some penetration in the market.
So Brian, are you seeing other evidence out there? Like what are audit committees doing with PCAOB inspection results, for example, things like that?
Well, I think most audit committees, and maybe this is that I've dealt with, and I've talked to a lot of other partners and all that, they're not sure what to do with them. I think they know there's good information in there, but what do they learn from them, and how do they apply that to their situation? Because I think we get the same questions like, well, tell me what happened in this particular issue. Yeah, like, well, if I wasn't involved, I really can't tell them what happened in that issue. But I can say, well, here's the general consensus of that type of issue. Here's how we interpret, here's how we apply it on this particular engagement. So there's a lot of interaction about the types of issues discovered or noted in the PCAOB inspection reports. I've even seen audit committee chairmen have them all on a table, and they've lined it out, the different firms trying to connect dots, and they have really trouble doing that because it's limited samples with limited information. So I think there's a lot of discussion about the PCAOB inspection reports, but in summary, I'm not sure people really know what to do with them. There's some other indicators, you know, like SEC comment letters and things like that get a lot of attention, but they're usually company specific. You know, I don't think there's a lot of focus on what happened to your neighbor. It's always going to be what happened on a company. And I think, Bob, your point about the service issues is probably one of the things that raises audit quality, because that indicates maybe things weren't done timely enough, either a quality issue on management side or the audit side or both. For these things to hit at the last minute is an indicator there's something going on, and audit committees are keenly aware of those.
So Mark, on the research side, with respect to oversight of the external auditor, what do you see out there?
Well, you know, if you look at these as kind of the input studies and the choices that the audit committees make, some of this, I think, some of the research, I think, ties well into some of these conversations. So more independent audit committees are associated with choosing industry specialist auditors. So and there's a lot of research that shows that industry specialist auditors tend to have fewer restatements, more high-quality reporting, that sort of thing. There's also evidence that independent audit committees pay higher audit fees. We mentioned that's associated with higher quality. You mentioned the relationship. There's a whole thriving and growing and fairly new research area that's quite interesting, looking at the auditor's reliance on the internal audit function. And it's such an interesting dynamic, and ties into this whole thing about the client demand side being so important, right? So the amount of audit quality delivered is going to be the supply and demand where they meet. So you have to have that demand going. And this, I think, really gets to that point. And so there's a recent study that shows that clients whose internal audit function is used as a training ground for future management, auditors don't rely on those audit committees or those internal audit functions quite as much, for obvious reasons. There's also evidence that independent audit committees are very concerned about minimizing perceived threats to audit quality. So they purchase, for example, less non-audit services and are less likely to hire former employees of the incumbent auditor, even though there's not a lot of research that would suggest non-audit services or former employees really do threaten quality, but there is evidence that shareholders may perceive that. So it's a kind of more of a perception than an actual issue, I think. The financial expertise is associated, the financial expertise, generally similar results, just weaker evidence, generally speaking. Meeting frequency and size, again, just fewer studies in that area. So in summary, I think there's relatively convincing evidence. It's a little bit smaller than the output studies, but these characteristics, especially independence and expertise, seem to matter.
Thank you. All right, on to our last of our 4 topics. Best practices for communicating with shareholders. This topic seems to have gotten a lot more attention recently, how audit committees communicate with shareholders, and shareholders seem to be expressing a lot more interest in the audit committee's role, its responsibilities, what it's doing to exercise its duties here. So I'm just going to throw this information out to the group. Is the information that shareholders receive from audit committees enough right now? And what are you seeing out there in the marketplace in terms of possible changes to the way audit committees communicate with shareholders?
I'll start. And I would say that in general, investors don't use a lot of input and information from the audit committee. The typical information that they get is from the audit committee report, which is in the proxy statement. It tends to be, to my way of thinking, for most companies, pablum. It is the legally required information, period, full stop. We are now beginning to see some companies that are presenting a little more information and pulling that black curtain down a little bit in terms of what we do and what our responsibilities are. But in general, I think investors and shareholders have gone to the PCAOB to try to get information through the external auditors, because that's where they can get data, that's where they can get information. It has only been recently that, with a lot of pushback from, quite frankly, audit committees, saying that some of the proposals and some of the suggestions out there are beginning to step on audit committees' toes, quite frankly, that you're beginning to see people say, oh, well, there are audit committees out there. Well, what do you guys do? And quite a bit of confusion that we actually are responsible for a number of things that they are now trying to get through the external auditors. So I think there is a communication gap. I think that communication gap is because we have no vehicle, we have no voice as an audit committee to provide more information in terms of what we do, how we do it, and we do a heck of a lot of work on behalf of investors. We just don't have a good vehicle to communicate that.
Okay.
I'd agree. This could be a really propitious time to look at this, because the auditor's report is up in the air right now, and
Exactly.
Jay and his colleagues will figure that out in relatively short order. So, to me, the audit committee report is not particularly useful in its present form. It's also in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that the 10K should have the management report on the effectiveness, it should have the auditor's report, and should have the audit committee report. If for no other reason, the awareness of the audit committee, what it does and who it's made up, all of that is people are amazingly naive, and I think it's probably time to retool that report to provide more relevant information without, getting into the specific issues, but
right.
to maybe highlight if there are, as the auditor's report might do in the near future, some of the things that people are thinking about. I just think right now it's not helpful, and it's even hard to find.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard of companies thinking, or audit committees holding town hall meetings with shareholders?
I heard, someone told me that. I had not heard that before. As an audit committee chair, I think there's a lot of other tools I'd like to use before I did a town hall meeting with investors. But I had heard that. I don't know who it was that was
Kinda
going
scary.
to do that, but God bless them.
Agree. All right, so we have a few minutes left here. Let's open it up to the group. I'm sure we've sparked some robust thoughts out there. We have microphones around. Mark's ready to fire away.
He's on sabbatical. He's not supposed to ask questions.
Okay, so a quick question, and the answer may not be quite as short. So a couple of the variations on for changes to the auditor's reporting model have probably, my guess is not as much legs, like the auditors, this notion of auditors discussion and analysis. So what I'm curious about, that's probably not going to manifest, but what I'm curious about is that a type of discussion that you want to have between auditors and audit committee members, for example? In other words, or even the more extreme version of this would have been then Chairman Barandino from Anderson, after the series of alleged frauds, let's put it that way. His story was the auditor's report. Why couldn't that have been even a letter grade? And what I'm wondering, when auditors have discussions with audit committee members, either in meetings or before meetings, do you want and do you get, and is that part of what's changed in the last decade, more frank discussions about the key estimates, tough judgment calls? In other words, maybe it's not the auditor's report where this conversation ultimately will end up, but maybe it is in this exchange between management, auditors, and audit committee members. That's basically the question.
I'll take the first stab. Mark, it's probably no surprise that the most interesting and relevant part of what we communicate to an audit committee, and I communicate, is not the SAS 61 or the ASS 14 or now AS 16 letter. It's really, audit committees really want to know what I think. I've been told that and extracted that in a lot of different ways, and they really want to know my observations about things. And I think accountants in general, I think it's probably a DNA thing that we're good at stating the facts, explaining what the literature says, and here's what happened. But they sometimes want to know how we connected the dots. And so I think that's the most important thing that I can provide when I'm providing this standard and its required communications, is to fill in the dots with what you might call an ADA. But it's really describing where we struggled, where it wasn't easy, where it was a close call. You know, I think that's what audit committees want from us.
And I think that happens in two ways. I think one happens in the actual audit committee meeting itself, but I think the more robust discussion sometimes happens between the lead partner and the audit committee chair in our meetings in between meetings, either on the phone, either telephonically or in person. That's where I get a lot of those types of discussions.
In private sessions as well.
Private sessions as well, yes.
Totally agree. I think that last point is key. One audit committee chair known to work with, one of the questions would be, are there any harebrained ideas that financial management came up with that we never saw because you killed it first?
Right.
I mean, it's an interesting question.
It really is.
So I mean, some of our best work is done, and it's so invisible to the outside, certainly even to the audit committee. But I do think I've got one client that actually asked for an oral AD&A ahead of the quarter. I've got one other that we do something that's sort of, bullets or, kind of a quasi-written version. But that is where the value happens, and that's why even a great audit committee report can't really capture the feeling of that or the effectiveness of that dialogue.
Right, totally agree.
Parveen, you had a question? Oh, I'm sorry.
So this conversation, of course, is focused on audit committee and is strengthening this audit committee, but audit committee is only a link in the governance chain from management to external auditors, internal auditors, and audit committee. When we focus our attention on audit committee, it's natural, perhaps easy, to describe its functions in terms of making it stronger, making it larger, giving more resources, giving more time, some of the issues that have been discussed. However, in terms of examining its consequences for the governance of the corporation, we also need to think about the impact of transferring more responsibility to the audit committee on responsibility of the auditors, just as putting more responsibility on the auditors had impact on responsibility of the management, which ends up with the Iskilling defense. People on the top said okay, people at the bottom said okay. What do I know? I'm just a poor CEO. I just signed on the blank sheet. So what are the consequences for management, for governance of the corporations, and for the auditing profession of putting more and more of this responsibility on audit committee and shifting more of these judgments to the audit committee? What are its long-run consequences? Is this really that good a thing to make audit committees stronger?
So
and what will happen next after this?
So let me try to restate your question to make sure that I heard it correctly, because one of the questions I asked earlier was, does the audit committee have too much responsibility, or all these things that we're talking about, are they in the right place with respect to the audit committee? Are you revisiting that question and saying?
Yes, and what are its consequences for responsibilities of management and external auditors?
Okay. So I think you heard the group say, and I'm interested in other comments here, that they felt like these responsibilities belonged with the audit committee. And you guys can fill in any blanks there, but I'm interested as to what others in the audience think. Do they think that the audit committee has too many responsibilities today, back to the consequences that Shyam's bringing up now?
And as we do that, let's distinguish between oversight of making the decisions
Exactly.
and making the decisions. I mean, the oversight piece is making sure, in most cases, the financial management, internal audit, and external audit are aligned. And if one of them is not, it's time for a discussion. I think that's very different than actually taking responsibility for the decision.
Totally agree.
Good point. Other thoughts out there? Ira, were you going to comment, or are you going to ask another question? It's coming, Giselle.
It's behind you, Giselle.
We can always hear you, Ira.
Okay, thank you. I was curious about your reactions to the following. Andy Fastow's been making the rounds at universities, and he was recently out at my shop. And one of the things that he said was, with respect to his culpability for what happened at Enron, was, well, I probably pushed the envelope too far, but at the same time, all of the professionals signed off, including the local folks who were on the board. So, I did my due diligence. What's your thought about that, and how that relates to the professional judgment rule and the culpability of audit committee and board members more generally? Is it too easy for them to sign off, saying, I did what represents due diligence here. I went to the experts, I got the lawyers, I got some accountants to sign off, and that then gives me a get-out-of-jail-free card with respect to the professional judgment rule?
Well, consider the source. But, so are you persuaded that was a good faith exercise? I wasn't in that situation, but I checked with this group, I checked with that group, I did my checklist, so it must be good. It just doesn't even feel like, the end of the day, it's on my shoulders to make the decision as the CFO. It feels like it's shifting blame to me. I'm not saying that those sign-offs were I don't know what the process was or whether they were wrong or lacked integrity, but he's now using that to say, well, you know, I had a lot of help.
Yeah, and my follow-up to that in the context of this discussion, is it too easy for the board to get there, given that they have the protection of the professional judgment?
No, I don't think it is easy for the board or the audit committee to get there, as you say. I think as a audit committee chair and a board member, I feel a great deal of responsibility for making sure that I understand the information that's coming before me, that I ask questions, good questions to the best of my judgment, that I listen hard to what my management team is telling me and what my external auditors are telling me, and counsel, if counsel is involved or engaged in that decision. And then I try to make the best judgment that I can on whatever the issue is that's coming before me. Now, I will tell you that I do rely on the business judgment rule to protect me because I'm not always going to make perfect decisions. But if you are a board member, particularly on an audit committee, you are taking your I would say most audit committee members, and I'm sure there are some out there that aren't, but most audit committees aren't viewing it as, you know, just something that you go there, you listen to people, you check the box, you go home and you get your check. I mean, we don't get paid enough to put our reputations nor our personal livelihoods at risk. They just don't pay me enough money for that.
Parveen, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, that's, thank you. It seems to me that what I'm hearing is that the responsibilities of the audit committees have increased considerably, particularly since the enactment of the SOX. And I just heard you say, probably for the second time, that we are not getting paid enough. And I am not taking these risks, or so on and so forth. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what are your views in terms of perhaps the time has come since the agenda of the audit committee, or for that matter, even the compensation committees or the risk committees, is going longer and longer, that maybe we ought to consider thinking about full-time professional directors as opposed to the current model that we have? I don't know what the views of the panelists are on that.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, the value of the board, one could argue, is the fact that they fulfill an oversight role, not a management role.
Right.
A full-time director, and you see this sometime in the UK, where a chairman, independent chairman, sort of comes to work every day as the chairman. The risk there, of course, is you start sliding into a quasi-management role and you lose the objectivity that is intended for a board role. So, you know, perhaps we should pay directors more across the board, but I would still prefer that a director spent, I don't know, 15, 20% of their time and no more, lest they just kind of get sort of sucked into the vortex of managing the company.
Yeah, I agree with that. We are not management as board members. And while I say we're not paid enough money, I also sort of look with a jaundiced eye on board members that need the board fees in order to have a livelihood. I think that is potentially a slippery slope that may cause individuals to make perhaps not quite their best judgments in order to retain their board seats. And I think we need to be independent enough of the company and hence the board fees that come with it, that you can make a hard decision or you can challenge someone. And if they choose not to re-elect you, so be it. But sort of a full-time board member, I don't know, it just doesn't seem to sit well, at least with me anyway.
No, I understand that the issues of objectivity and putting your fingers into the operations, because directors are supposed to be more like NIFO, right? Nose in and fingers out. But what is the solution? Because on one hand, we are hearing that your responsibilities, your commitments are increasing. You're being held to higher standards. More and more laws and regulations are coming. And I'm not sure, and I'm pretty sure on that you are doing what you're supposed to do, whether you're getting paid or not. So what is the solution here? How are we going to improve the quality of the overall governance from the board? Board is supposed to have the oversight responsibilities, and it is clear that the time is less. They do not have that amount of time that they need to do a good job. So what do you suggest? How do we improve this thing going forward?
One huge opportunity is to kill PowerPoints.
That should be easy to do.
Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times that you sit in a board meeting and have somebody, whether it's management or an external auditor or whomever, come up and they'll have PowerPoint slides and they'll click through all the stuff that was in the pre-mail, and rather than having maybe a summary slide with the one or two issues you need to discuss and sort of get to the conversation. And as a board, some of these people come before you maybe once, period. They just don't get before the board for whatever reason, whatever their job responsibilities are. And you hate to sort of chop them off at the knees and say, sort of get on with it. And so you let them sort of, and it's...
Well, it seems we have found an easy solution today. Kill the PowerPoints, right?
Yeah, you could save a lot of time, I tell you.
Now that issue comes up constantly in surveys of boards. The mix between discussion time and presentation time. Boards are always clamoring for more discussion time. Now, I suspect in some cases that kind of transcends down to the committee level, depending on sort of the culture of how the board operates. But I would think some smart academics come up with an effectiveness formula for boards of directors so that they could actually make better use of the time they do spend, but I don't know.
We probably have time for one, maybe two more questions if they're brief. I see Joe in the back. You'll have plenty of time to get more of these thoughts down on paper after lunch. Go ahead, Joe.
A quick comment and then a question. The comment on the PowerPoints, Michelle, I chair a not-for-profit audit committee. And what I do is I tell the professional service providers, you have X amount of time for PowerPoint or presentation, and that's it, because I want to have time for Q&A. And when they hit the time, if they're not done, I cut them off. And so that generally works pretty well. They stay within the time limits. The question I have, and I want your input, Michelle, and then Bob. You made a statement, Michelle, if I heard you right, something to the effect that you think it's hard to get A players onto audit committees at smaller companies, mid-sized companies, and smaller companies.
Sometimes. I did say,
sometimes.
Yes.
And I'm curious, maybe for you to elaborate on that and then have Bob talk about it. And here's where I'm coming from. I won't mention the name. But Bob and I both served with a person on the SAG for a number of years who was a high-level accounting person at a major corporation. And this person very much wanted to be invited to the dance, and we'll call the dance serving on audit committees of public companies. And I don't think he was limited to just the very biggest. And what he said to me is generally, he's not being asked out a whole lot. That generally there's this strong preference for CEOs and CFOs, preferably sitting, but if not sitting, at least recently retired. And someone like him who was a very, very senior accounting person, let's just say controller or chief accounting officer, who I think would be great, especially given the research, Mark, that you talked about in terms of the accounting background, is not being invited that much. And so when I hear people talk about the difficulty of getting really good people onto audit committees of mid-sized companies, I think of people like this individual. I think of all the partners who are retiring every year at 58 or whatever ridiculously young age you guys are required to retire at.
Be careful, Bob Moritz just showed up. He's in the back.
Hey, Bob. And so there's a lot of talent, I think, to serve on these audit committees. So I'm curious for you maybe to flesh it out.
Yeah, there absolutely is a lot of talent. I spend, in part of my day job is to find directors for boards. The issue, I think, is one, we talk about the expectation gap in accounting. There's an expectation gap in directorships as well, because small and mid-sized companies want A-level players. They want the CEOs, they want the CFOs, they want people that have, that serve as C-suite executives in, Fortune, 250 companies. They are sorely disappointed when you bring them a slate of candidates that are such as the gentleman that you had described, and that, you know, they might not be able to get somebody that served at, you know, Walmart to sit on their board. And so there is indeed an expectation gap between on small and mid-sized companies in terms of the attractiveness. And there are fabulous people out there that are perfectly capable of serving in director roles, not only financial executives, but diverse individuals, women executives. And it's hard as heck to get them placed on boards of any size.
Yeah, so the problem is the purchase order, the way that's written.
Yes,
You know,
good way,
and,
yes.
And it's consistently, to Michelle's point, the way she said, and then it's perpetuated by the search firms who specialize in this. They tend to come up with the same old name. So but it's all about board diversity and being able to open the aperture to more qualified people and getting chairs and nominating governance committees to see that they can't all have the same 250 CEOs who aren't available anyway.
All right, I knew that there would be no shortage of conversation with this group. So I appreciate the time. We're eating into the lunch hour now, so it is now time for us to
Margot's
break.
going like this in the back.
And so
So thank you so much for a very, very provocative panel. And so you've given us a lot to think about as we eat lunch, and then we're going to have our brainstorming session. So join me in thanking Trent, Bob, Mark, Michelle, and Brian.